How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chafei, Daf 25 of Masechet Ksubis. Friends, the sugya really today is the sugya of Mailin L'Nesius Kapayim L'Yuchsin. Can you assume that because a fellow gave the priestly blessings in the synagogue, so that he is a kohen and that therefore he could sort of marry into whatever that special lineage is? And with that, friends, we will begin our journey into Daf Chafei of Masechet Ksubis. Now, we got a shtick of work to do from Daf Chav Daled. It kind of continues for a while into Chafei, which is, and I don't know, yesterday I was kind of tired, so we just kind of stopped early. But so we got some work to do, but alright, what do you want me to tell you, you gotta work hard. Alright. So we're on Daf Chav Daled is about halfway, even I'd say even a little bit less than halfway down the Daf and Chav Daled where it says Iboyu Lahu. It's the second word on the line. Iboyu the Asakasha. So as I said, right, this is our sugya today. Can you assume that because a fellow blessed the congregation as a priest, that therefore he's a priest and therefore he could marry, people who you need to be pretty special in order to marry? Period. So, so let's say you are of the opinion that that if you see a fellow consuming truma, you can assume that he's a kohen, legabe yuchsin. So, what about here? What about if you see him not eating truma but blessing the congregation? And what about, according to the opinion who says that just because you see a fellow eating truma, that does not mean that you can assume that he has priestly lineage? But what about if you see him bless the congregation? So again, can you assume that because a fellow duchins, so that he can marry special people? I mean, I think there are different opinions about what yuchsin is, but let's just say it means to be able to marry bas kohen, because we want kohanim to marry bas kohens, and that's ideal. So so let's say, if we want to marry a kohen and a bas kohen, so can we assume that because he blessed the congregation, he can marry a bas kohen? So now this is a question, both according to the opinion who says that if you see a fellow eat truma, you can assume that he could, that he can be Mailin L'Yuchsin. And also, according to the opinion who says that even if you eat a fellow eat truma, nonetheless you cannot be Mailin L'Yuchsin. So even according to the opinion who says that if you see a fellow eat truma, then that means that Mailin L'Yuchsin, but nonetheless it's still a question by duchening. Hanimile truma, because I'll say that only by truma can be Mailin mi truma L'Yuchsin, the avon misa, because after all, if a non-kohen eats truma, it's misa b'dei shamayim. That's pretty serious. And therefore, because of the gravity of the punishment for a zar who eats truma, so if you see a fellow eating truma, memele you can assume that he's a kohen because he wouldn't be eating truma otherwise. Avol nesius kapayim deser essay lo. But if you see a fellow duchening, giving the priestly blessings, that doesn't mean that you cannot assume necessarily. Meaning you cannot necessarily assume that he is a priest in that Mailin L'Yuchsin, because after all, the priestly blessings are only a mitzvah's essay. It's not a lav. It's not a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, and therefore it's not as significant. And he might bless the congregation even if he isn't actually a kohen. Odilma loshna, or perhaps it doesn't make a difference. And according to the opinion who says Mailin Truma L'Yuchsin, you would also say Mailin L'Nesius Kapayim L'Yuchsin. So we're not sure. And Tibayim Adamar Ein Mailin, and we're also not sure, according to the opinion that if you see a fellow eating truma, that does not mean that you can be Mailin L'Yuchsin, but maybe that's just Hanimili Truma D'Misach L'Betzinu. Maybe that's only by truma, because truma is eaten in private. You don't go out in public and eat truma necessarily. But the priestly blessings will be in public, right, at a minyan. So therefore, we should take that more stringently. So even if you say that by Truma, ein Madlin Truma Liyuchsin, maybe by Nisius Kapayim, Madlin the Nisius Kapayim Liyuchsin, because it's in public and he's willing to go out there in public in front of all the people and bless them, so Mimele must be a Kohen. Ilav Kohen, where am I? The Pharisee, Ilav Kohenu, Kulelo Machze finish Nafshe, and he wouldn't go and bless the people in front of everybody if he wasn't actually a Kohen. Or maybe it doesn't actually make a difference, and just like ein Madlin Truma Liyuchsin, ein Madlin Nisius Kapayim Liyuchsin. So we're trying to figure out, friends, Mailan Nisius Kapayim Liyuchsin or ein Mailan Nisius Kapayim Liyuchsin. Friends, what do you think? It's machlokes. Rav Chisda Rav Avinu, Charam or Mailan, Vecharam or ein Mailan. Nice, clean machlokes. You know, it's a machlokes. One says yes, one says no. That's a nice, clean machlokes, no? Omer Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak l'Rav. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says to Rav, Ma'od lahalus minisius kapayim liyuchsin. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak asked Rav, no, Ma'od lahalus minisius kapayim liyuchsin. Can you assume that if a fellow does birkas kohanim that he's a kohen and he can marry all sorts of fancy people? Omer plukta to Rav Chisda Rav Avinu. So Rav says to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, it's a machlokes. It's a machlokes Rav Chisda and Rav Avinu. Hilchsamai. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, no, okay, what's the halacha? Rav says, look, I can tell you a brisa. The Tanya is learning a brisa. Rabbi Yossi Omer says Rabbi Yossi, Gedol chazake, that chazakes are pretty stark, that chazakes are pretty strong, pretty significant, that, you know, a gezer d'Rabbanan is unable to undo a chazake. A chazake kilu, an established practice. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Ezra, Bnei HaKoyanim, Bnei Chavaya, Bnei HaKotz, Bnei Barzilai, Asher Lokach Mibnos Barzilai Agilat Isha, Ve'ikari Ashmam. Okay, so there were these families, Ele Bikshu Ksavma Misachsim V'lo Nimtzo, and they were unable to find their papers, their documentation to prove that they were Kohanim. Va'igoalu Min HaKehuna. So therefore they were not allowed to be Kohanim, because they could not prove that they were Kohanim. Vayomer HaTirshasa Loim, and HaTirshasa, who is Nehemiah ben Chachaya, Nehemiah says to them, Asher lo yochlu mikodesh hakodesh ad amod kohen l'urim v'tumim, you will not be able to eat korbanis until basically the third base, until Mashiach comes. Omer lehem, what Nehemiah was saying to them, Hari atem b'chezkaschem, that you can basically stick with whatever your chazake was. That just like in the Galus, you were able to eat truma, which is midar abonon, outside of Eretz Yisrael. So avkan b'kodshei agvul. So now that you're in Eretz Yisrael, also you'll only be able to eat truma der abonon, but, or at least we'll see, maybe it's takam machlekes, whatever it is. But also, you know, now kodshim as well, truma you can eat now as well. So meaning what? So what Nehemiah is saying is that these families were unable to prove that they were Kohanim, and therefore they were not able to eat korbanos. They were not able to eat kodshim, as the imurim that the Kohanim can eat. But whatever the chazaki was, whatever they were doing in Bavel, such as eating truma, so they can continue to eat truma in Eretz Yisrael. But korbanos are off limits. Now, now, if it enters your mind to say that if you see a fellow do birkas kohanim, so then you can assume that he's a kohen. And now Rashi points out, and therefore the assumption is that just like in Bavel they were eating truma, also in Bavel they were doing birkas kohanim. And just like now when they come to Eretz Yisrael, even though they cannot eat korbanos, they can eat truma, they would also be able to continue doing birkas kohanim. And now, right? And if it enters your mind to say that if you see a fellow doing birkas kohanim, you can assume that he's a kohen. Well, then people are going to see them doing birkas kohanim. They're going to see them duchening and assume that they're kohanim, even though that's not true. So therefore, the Gemara is saying, you know, it would be hard to argue Madlin Minasius Kapayim Liyuchsin. It would be difficult to argue that if you see a fellow do birkas kohanim, you can assume that he's a kohen, because if that's the case, then I don't understand what Nehemiah is allowing over here. that Nehemiah is saying that even though we can't assume that you're Kohanim because you can't prove it, but we can allow you to continue eating Truma, we can allow you doing Birkas Kohanim, but people are going to get confused because they're going to see people doing Birkas Kohanim and they're going to assume that they're Kohanim, but it's not really true. So therefore, this only makes sense if you say that Ein Mailin Minisius Kapayim Liyuchsin. And that's why he was allowed to allow them to duchen. Shani Achad Reach Kayu. To which the Gemara says, meh. The Gemara says, meh. It's not such a good proof. Meaning, I could still say, Mailim Minisius Kapayim Liyuchsin. I could still argue that yes, if you see a fellow duchen, you can assume he's a Kohen. But over here, aren't the people going to get confused? No, they won't. They won't get confused because they'll see that these people are duchening, but they're not eating korbanos with the rest of the Kohanim. Clearly, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with the picture over here, and they're not going to assume that these people will be able to marry Kohanim because liyuchsin, because even though they see them duchening, they also see that they're not eating truma korbanos. So therefore, so even though in general we'd say Maila Minisios Kapayim Liyuchsin, it's not a concern that over here you're going to think that these people are Kohanim because of the fact that they don't eat korbanos. The ilo teimachi, and you have to say like this because if you don't say like this, according to the opinion that if you see a fellow eating truma, then you can assume that they are Kohanim and Maila Truma Liyuchsin. Came the achle betrume. Also, you can ask the same question then about Truma, right? That if you see them eating Truma, then you're going to assume that they're Kohanim, but it's not really true. Rather, it must be that, look, even if you say Malam Truma Liyuchsin, it's not a concern over here because they're not eating Korbanis, and therefore, even though they're eating Truma, nobody sees them eating Korbanis, and therefore, there's questions already about them. And we're not concerned that people are going to assume that because they're eating truma that they can, marry these fancy people that they need to be eligible to marry. Now, ve'ela my gidol chazake. No, so if we're saying that when they were in Bavel they were able to eat truma, and now in Eretz Yisrael they can eat truma, so what's so special about this chazake? So, meikara achul b'truma d'Rabbanan hashta achul b'truma d'Oraisa. Here's the chiddush. The chiddush is that a chazaka is so strong, that an established practice is so strong, that if we saw that in Bavel they were eating truma, now that they come to Eretz Yisrael, they can continue eating truma, not only truma d'Rabbanan like in Bavel, but even now in Eretz Yisrael they'll be able to eat truma d'Oraisa. Right, meikar achul b'truma d'Rabbanan hashta achul b'truma d'Oraisa. Now they're even able to eat truma d'Oraisa. V'bay sema, or alternatively I will say hashta nami b'truma d'Rabbanan achul b'truma d'Oraisa lo achul. No, you can also say that now when they came back to Eretz Yisrael, also they were only eating truma d'Rabbanan, no truma d'Oraisa. Right, truma d'Oraisa would be dagon tirosh v'yitzar. Right, truma from grain, wine, oil. That's truma d'Oraisa. Grain from truma from vegetables, from apples, right, from other fruits and stuff, that's only truma d'Rabbanan. So you could say that even, right, these families, they were able to eat truma in Bavel, where it was only mid'Rabbanan, it wasn't mid'Oraisa. And also even in Eretz Yisrael, they were only able to eat truma d'Rabbanan, not truma d'Oraisa. And when we say that, and when we have this concept of that if you see a fellow eating truma, then you can assume that he can marry fancy people. So b'truma d'Oraisa, that's only by truma d'Oraisa, b'truma d'Rabbanan lo maskinon. But if you're only eating truma d'Rabbanan, it's not actually a concern that they're not actually going to be ma'ilin mitruma liyuchsin by d'Rabbanan, and therefore these people, if you're asking, but if they eat truma, if you see these people eating truma, then you might think that the ma'ilin liyuchsin, that they can marry, these people that they need to be kohanim to marry. No, it's not a concern over here because over here they're only eating truma d'Rabbanan. Anyways, the ma'ilin mitruma liyuchsin it would be if you see them eating truma d'Oraisa. Ve'ela ma gedol chazkayu. So then, what's so stark about their chazaka? Meaning, in Bavel they were able to eat truma d'Rabbanan. Here they're also only able to eat truma d'Rabbanan. So what's so strong about the chazaka? Da'afagav diika lemigzar mishum truma d'Oraisa lo gozrinun. That even though I may have thought to say, well, if they're only allowed to eat Truma D'Rabbanan, maybe we should say that they're not allowed to eat Truma D'Rabbanan out of concern that they might end up eating Truma D'Oraisa. But we don't make that the Gezerah. How come we don't make that Gezerah? Because of the Chazaka. Because since they have a Chazaka, an established practice of already being able to eat Truma D'Rabbanan in Bavel, so also when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they can continue eating Truma D'Rabbanan, and we don't say, stay away from it out of concern that you might eat Truma D'Oraisa. No, because you have an established practice, even in Eretz Yisrael, you can continue eating the Truma D'Rabbanan. And for Truma D'Oraisa, lo achu. 1 second. Is it really true that these families did not eat Truma D'Oraisa, that they were only able to eat Truma D'Rabbanan when they got to Eretz Yisrael? But the Pasuk says, right, that Nehemiah had said to them, Asher lo yochlu m'kodshei hakodshim, Mikodesh HaKodshim, that they can't eat korbanos. Mikodesh HaKodshim udu lo achol. They're not allowed to eat korbanos, but Truma D'Oraisa achol, but they are allowed to eat Truma, even Truma D'Oraisa. No, this is how to understand it. What does it mean? Mikodesh HaKodoshim? Lo b'midei de'ikrei kodesh, that they're not allowed to eat things that are called kodesh, i.e. Truma D'Oraisa. It says any non-Kohen is forbidden to eat kodesh, and that's a reference to Truma, so meaning Truma. So it says that they can't eat from the kodesh HaKodoshim. It means from the kodesh, anything that's called kodesh, i.e. Truma. Lo b'midei de'ikrei kodshim, and not from anything that's called kodshim. Right, that they also cannot eat korbanos, they cannot eat the emurim of the korbanos, as the pasuk says that we learned to Masechta Yevamis, that it says that if you have a bas kohen who is you have a bas kohen and she gets married to a Yisrael and then she gets divorced and they don't have kids, and she goes back home, she can continue eating truma, she can go back to eating truma, but she cannot eat the emurim. When she was growing up, she could eat the emurim. But if she gets married to Yisrael and then divorced, while she can go back home and eat truma, she cannot eat the meat from the korbanos. Right? So it says, that if you have a bas kohen who marries a Yisrael, and then they get divorced, and there's no kids, or he dies, he b'trumas hakodshim lo sochal. When she goes back home, she can't eat the trumas hakodshim, ve'omer mar b'muram min hakodshim lo sochal. It means the emurim, right? The parts, like the breast and the leg that they get from the animals, she cannot partake in when she goes back to her father's house. So we see what Nehemiah was saying, that yes, you cannot eat the korbanos, but you also cannot eat truma mideoraisa. Alright, what do I mean to tell you? Toshma, come in here. Chazaki l'chehuna nesius kapayim b'Bavel. Alright. Just 1 second, just to go back a second. So we were trying to figure out if Nesius Kapayim Liyuchsin or not. We wanted to make the argument that you can't be Ma'alin Nesius Kapayim Liyuchsin, but we ended up saying no, maybe you can be Ma'alin Nesius Kapayim Liyuchsin. It wasn't clear. So now we're trying to bring another proof. Tashma coming here. Chazaki l'chehuna, that how can you tell if someone's a Kohen? Nesius Kapayim b'Bavel. Well, if in Babylon they do the priestly blessing, Vachilas chala b'Surya, or in Syria, I think it's basically Syria, was an area that David HaMelech captured and annexed, made part of Eretz Yisrael. And the assumption for now is that it's part of Eretz Yisrael. It's can be chayiv and chala midoraisa. V'chiluk matonas b'krochin, and also the matnos kahuna, right? If you slaughter an animal, so then the zoya and the l'chayim and the keva go to the kohen. You give the arm and the jaw and the stomach, I think, to a kohen. So in any of these, right, in cities, right, in cities where there are a lot of people, that a fellow would only collect these parts of the animal if he was a kohen, because otherwise people would call him out. So again, tashmach chazak l'chuna, here are sort of how you can establish that a fellow is a kohen, nesios kapayim b'Bavel. If in Babylonia a fellow is blessing the congregation as a priest, v'achilas chala b'Surya, or eating chala in Syria, right? Sort of this truma of chala in Syria. V'chiluk matonas b'krochin, and if he chapsarain the matnas kahuna, the zoar l'chayim v'keva, the jaw, the leg, and the stomach from animals in cities. Katoni mias nesius kapayim. No, so we just mentioned that you can assume that a fellow is a kohen if you see him doing the priestly blessings. My love liyuchsin. What does it mean that you can assume that he's a kohen? It means liyuchsin, that you can marry him off to these whoever needs sort of this fancy kohen status to marry. Lo letruma. No, it means Ma'alin Nesius Kapayim Lechuna. It means that if you see him doing the priestly blessings, you can give him truma to eat. But 1 second. You can't say that you can assume that if he does the priestly blessing, you can give him truma to eat. Because what's the next example in there? Is if he's eating challah. Now challah itself is called truma, right? It says, Reishis arisosechem challah tarimu truma. Challah is called a truma. So therefore, clearly, the point isn't that if you see him eating challah in Surya, then you can give him truma, because challah is a type of truma. Maybe if you see him eating challah, then he can eat truma as well. But the point is that if you see him eating challah, then you can assume even for yuchsin. And therefore we want to say that just like eating challah, the point is if you see him eating challah, so then you can assume that he is, madl liyuchsin. So then the same thing would be for the priestly blessing, which is listed right next to it. That if you see him doing the priestly blessing, you can assume that he madl liyuchsin. Lo achilas challah gufe letrume. No, if you see the fellow eating challah, so then you can give him truma to eat. And kasover challah b'zmanazeh d'Rabbanan, and the brisa is assuming that challah nowadays is only midrabanan, whereas truma deoraisa. Whereas truma is midoraisa, maskina mechallah derabanan letruma deoraisa. And if we see him eating challah, which is midrabanan, we can then assume that he's actually a kohen, because if he wasn't a kohen, we wouldn't allow him to eat challah, because then we'd be concerned that maybe he'll eat truma, which is midoraisa. So we say, look, if you see him eating challah, then you can assume that he's a kohen, and then he can eat truma as well. As we're going to see in a few minutes, that Rav Huna ber Yeshua basically said like this, that challah b'zmanazeh d'Rabbanan, and we're saying that if you see the fellow eat challah, then you can assume that he can eat truma as well. So this is not going to enable us to make the argument that if you see him blessing the congregation, then he'll be able to be ma'alin liyuchsin. No, because we're talking about truma, we're not talking about yuchsin. Toshma, come in here. Chazake lechehuna nesius kapayim v'chil granus beretz Yisrael. That the chazake for kehuna, okay, is if you see a fellow doing the priestly blessings, as well as if he's eating truma in Eretz Yisrael, and in Surya, now the assumption over here is that Surya is not actually part of Eretz Yisrael, in any place outside of Eretz Yisrael, that the messengers who go around telling the people when Rosh Chodesh is, so that they can know when to make the holidays. So any of these places that they can get to within 15 days, so Nesius Kapayim Raya, so then if you see them doing the priestly blessing in these places, so then you can assume that he's a kohen. Avalo chilugranis, but eating truma in these places would not be a raya that he's a kohen. Ubavel kisuria, and bavel is treated like surya, that Nesius Kapayim would be approved, but not eating truma. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Af Alexandria Shom Mitzrayim Barishona, also Alexandria would be considered like Bavel Mpnei Shebezdin Kvuin Sham, because there's a Bezdin there, and therefore, if the fellow was doing the priestly blessings, we can assume that, the Bezdin has checked him out, and he is, in fact, a Kohen. Katani Mias, right? I'm sorry, so Alexandria Sham Mitzrayim was like Surya, right? So Bavel was like Surya, Alexandria was like Surya, fine. So Katani Mias, so we taught Nesius Kapayim, so we mentioned the priestly blessing. My lively yuchsin. So let's say the priestly blessing for yuchsin, that if you see him doing the priestly blessing, you can assume that my lively yuchsin. Lo lechala. Now, if you see him doing the priestly blessing, then he can eat challah. Hadumi dechili granus katani. But we compare the priestly blessing to eating truma. Machili granus liyuchsin af nesius kapayim liyuchsin. And memela, just like we said earlier, right, that just like eating truma is going to have to be for madin liyuchsin and not for challah, because truma is, challah and truma are both types of truma, so therefore it must be liyuchsin. So also nesius kapayim, which is compared to truma, right, which is listed together with Truma, is going to be Liyuchsin. Lo, Chiligronis Gufa Lechala. No, Chiligronis Truma. If you see meaning Truma, then you can assume they can eat Chala. And according to this Brisa, Kasavar Truma Bisman Hazeh D'Rabbanon, that Truma nowadays is Midrabanon, whereas V'chala D'Oraisa, whereas Chala is D'Oraisa, Maskinim Truma D'Rabbanon, V'chala D'Oraisa. And if you see that he's eating Truma, which is Midrabanon, you can also assume that he's a Kohen, and therefore he can even eat Chala, which is D'Oraisa. It's like Rav Huna B'Reder Yeshua found the rabbis, the Omar Rav Huna B'Reder Yeshua, that says, Rav Huna B'Reder Yeshua, I found the rabbis in the Beis HaMedrash, the Yazvi B'Kamer, that they were saying, that even according to the one who says that Truma nowadays is Midrabanon, Chala D'Oraisa. Chala nonetheless is Midoraisa. Sharei, because lo and behold, after all, Zayin Shekivshu v'Zayin Shechilku, that after the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael with Yoshua, and they were capturing the place for 7 years, and then they were dividing it up among the different tribes for 7 years. Nischayv b'Chala. That entire time, they're already chayiv in chala, whereas v'lo nischayiv b'truma sumaisis, but during that entire time, they were not yet chayiv in truma sumaisis, and therefore, we're saying that chala is midoraisa, and that bezman hazeh, chala is doraisa, but truma is dirabanan. V'aminu lu'ana, and says Rav Huna B'Reder Yeshua, that I said to them, Adrabah, Taka punkt verkehrt, the opposite. I feel that even according to the opinion who says that Truma Bisman Hazeh is midoraisa, Chala D'Rabbanon, Chala is D'Rabbanon, Titania, as we learn in a Brisa B'Vachim El Haaretz, that when you come to Eretz Yisrael, that is in the context of wait, what is this? Wait, that is that's talking about Chala, right? 1 second. B'vachim. Yeah, I believe that this is by Chala. Okay, I'm just saying that it's. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. B'vachim el haaretz says by Chala. B'vachim el haaretz, when you come to Eretz Yisrael, b'vachim yochim mishenichnesu la shnayim v'shloshim raglim. Is it possible that even when 2 or 3 of them raglim, once they got into Eretz Yisrael, at that point they're already chayiv in Chala? Tamlam b'vachim v'yas kulchem amarti. It says no, b'vachim, when all of you, when everybody, all the Yidden get to Eretz Yisrael. V'lo b'v'yas mikzaschem, not just when some of you get to Eretz Yisrael. So we see that Chala is dependent on when all of the Yidden are in Eretz Yisrael. V'chiaskinu Ezra, and when the Yidden came back to Eretz Yisrael during the times of Ezra for the second temple, lav kulu saluk, not everybody came back to Eretz Yisrael with Ezra. As Rashi says, Ruba nisharu beBavel. Most of the Yidden stayed in Babylonia, stayed in Bavel. So therefore, says Rav Huna B'Reder Yeshua, that actually Chala B'Zman Hazeh would only be Midrabanon, because Chala is dependent on all of the Yidden being in Eretz Yisrael, and during the time of when the Yidden came back to Eretz Yisrael during Ezra, it wasn't most of the Jews, and therefore Chala would only be Midrabanon nowadays. Toshma, Chazaka L'chuna Nesius Kapayim. So a Chazaka for Kehuna is Nesius Kapayim, is Duchening, B'chilik Gronis, as well as eating Truma. Ve'edus and testimony. If you have 2 witnesses testifying that a fellow is a Kohen, so then that is a chazaka that he is a Kohen. Edus chazaka. What do you mean that testimony is a chazaka? Chazaka, testimony is testimony. Testimony is treated as fact, not just an assumption. A chazaka is an assumption, right? That sort of you've established a practice enough that we can assume that it's true. But testimony is actually truth right there. So what do you mean that testimony is a chazaka? Testimony is testimony. Lav achi commerce. We want to say that this is what it means. Nesius kapayim ki edus. That nesius kapayim duchening is like testimony. Ma edus liyuchsin af nesius kapayim liyuchsin. And just like if you testify that a fellow is a Kohen, so you can assume that man liyuchsin, that he can marry all these fancy people as a Kohen. So we'll say the same thing is also by duchening, right? The priestly blessing. If you see a fellow doing the priestly blessing, you can assume that he can marry any of these special people. Lo edus abo mikoya chazaka ki chazaka. No, rather, no, it means that testimony that comes from a chazaka is treated like a chazaka. What does that mean? Ki ha'uda also the commander bami. For example, we're going to see a few stories now to illustrate this concept. That there was a fellow that came before Reb Ami, Omerle, and he says to Reb Ami, Muchzakoni boze sheu koyin. He says to Reb Ami, look, I'm sure that this fellow is a koyin. Omerle Mara Yisa, he says, why are you so sure? Omerle shekar rishon bebeis hakneses. Well, he got the first aliyah in shul. That's the koyin aliyah. So we say, 1 second, bechezka shu koyin and bechezka shu gadol. 1 second. Did he read the first aliyah because he's a kohen, or did he read the first aliyah because there were no kohanim and he was a great person? So if there's no kohen, so then you honor, you give the first aliyah as an honor to a great person there. Shekar achar of Levi. So the Gemara says, yeah, but after the kohen, right after him, read a Levi. So clearly it was in order. So he read first, followed by Levi, which means that Memele is a kohen. Rabbi Ami says, okay, sounds like a kohen to me. I'm convinced. How would also the commentary of Yeshua ben Levi? There was a fellow who came before Yeshua ben Levi, Amarle, and he says to Yeshua ben Levi, Muchzakoni boze shu Levi. He says to Yeshua ben Levi, look, I can tell that this fellow is a Levi. Amarle, ma ra'isa. What makes you think he's a Levi? Amarle, shekar sheni bebeis hakneses. Well, he got the second aliyah in the shul. B'chezka shu Levi, b'chezka shu gadol. 1 second, does that mean that he's a Levi, or does that mean that he's a great person, that they gave him that aliyah? Shekar, the fun of kohen. Well, before him, there was a kohen. So maybe if the first guy was a kohen, so then the second guy is going to be a Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, l'lefi al-piv, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, okay, sounds like a Levi to me. Done. How would also the commentary of Rish Lakish? A fellow came before Rish Lakish, Amalei says to Rish Lakish, Muchzakoni boze shu kohen. Says, look, I'm certain that this other fellow over here is a kohen. Amalei mara isa. So Rish Lakish says, what makes you think so? Amalei shekar rishon bebeis hakneses. He got the first aliyah in shul. Amalei re'isiv shechilik alagronis. Rish Lakish says, wait a second, I'm not convinced. Did you see that he ate trumah? Amalei Rebbe Lazar. To which Rebbe Lazar says to Rish Lakish, 1 second, Rish Lakish, that's not fair. V'im ein shem gorin b'teila kehuna. And says Rebbe Lazar to Rish Lakish, I don't understand. And if they don't live next to a place where there's farms and people aren't giving him trumah, so then you can't prove any other way that he's a kohen. Now another time they were sitting before Rabbi Yochanan, also Kiya Ma'aseh L'Kameh, and then a similar story came before Rabbi Yochanan. That a fellow says, I know that this person is a kohen. I see he gets the first aliyah in shul. Amalei Rish Lakish says to this fellow who's testifying to Rabbi Yochanan, 1 second, Mr. Fellow, did you see that he was given trumah? Amalei Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, V'im ein shem goren b'teila kehuna. Just like Rabbi Lazar says, Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, he says, what? And if there's no granaries around to be able to give this guy trumah, what? Is there no way to prove otherwise that he's a kohen? And then Rish Lakish got upset with Rabbi Lazar. Omer Shamas Mile Dibanafcha v'lo Omer Tlon Mishmei. He says, 1 second. Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Lazar, he says, you said to me the other day this exact thing that Rabbi Yochanan just said to me. You said, what, if there's no granaries, then can we not prove that he's a kohen? I didn't know that you heard that from Rabbi Yochanan. Why didn't you say that you got that from Rabbi Yochanan? Of course, Rabbi Yochanan was the greatest of them, right? Was the greatest over here. There was Rabbi Yochanan, who's Chavrusa, who was Rish Lakish, right? He was Makariv Rish Lakish, and then there's Rabbi Lazar, who was also a student of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was kind of the head honcho there. And Rish Lakish looks to Rabbi Lazar, right? When Rabbi Yochanan gives the same answer as Rabbi Lazar had given to Rish Lakish, Rish Lakish looks to Rabbi Lazar, he says, you didn't tell me that you heard this from Rabbi Yochanan. Friends, that's the Avchafei of Masechet Ksubis. Well, the theme of today's daf is we were trying to figure out Mailin mi Birkas Kohanim liyuchsin. Right? Can you assume that if a fellow does the priestly blessing, that he's a kohen? Right, he's a kohen to the extent that he can marry sort of people that you have to be a kohen in order to marry. And we haven't really been able to prove it so much. So, okay, well, that's Daf Chafev, Masechet Ksubis. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.